Why can a Japanese carpenter cut a joint so tight it holds for 100 years, with no glue and no screws, while the rest of us are reaching for one more clamp? It comes down to a handful of habits and tricks, and most of them cost nothing but a change in how you work. I have been at a home bench for more than 25 years, and I built a lot of loose joints, and ruined a lot of good boards before any of this clicked. These 25 tricks come out of Japanese carpentry, but you do not need a single Japanese tool to use most of them. You need to change how you cut, how you mark, and how you sharpen. Stick with me to the end, because the last one is the strangest of the bunch. It is a trick where you crush the wood on purpose to make a joint fit tighter, which sounds completely backwards until you understand it, and it locked up joints for me that no clamp ever could. And somewhere in the middle of this list is one that is not a tool or a cut at all. It is a habit, and it tightened more of my sloppy joints than any chisel I ever bought. Let me start where the cut starts, with the saw. A Japanese pull saw, a ryoba or a dozuki, cuts on the pull stroke instead of the push. That one difference changes everything downstream. When you push a saw, the thin blade wants to buckle, so Western saws have to be thick and stiff just to survive the shove. Pull the blade instead and it stays in tension, straight as a guitar string, so the plate can be thin. We are talking a kerf, which is just the width of the slot the blade cuts, of around 12 thousandths of an inch on a good dozuki. That is about the thickness of 3 sheets of printer paper. A typical Western backsaw cuts a slot 2 or 3 times that wide. Thinner kerf, less wood turned to dust, less muscle, and a cut you can actually steer. A ryoba, by the way, is the 2-edged one. Rip teeth down one side for cutting along the grain, cross-cut teeth down the other for cutting across it. So a single saw does the work of 2. The dozuki is the finer one, with a stiff spine over the top for clean joinery cuts. Between those two you can cut nearly everything a normal project throws at you. A Gyokucho dozuki runs about $35, and it will outcut a push saw twice its price. I put off buying one for years, because it looked like a novelty in the catalog. It is not a novelty. It is the first saw I reach for now, and my old push saw mostly holds down a shelf. 2 more that live right at the saw. Reading the grain before you cut or plane is the whole difference between a clean surface and a torn one. Grain runs like the scales on a fish. Run your hand one way and it is smooth. The other way it snags. Plane or pare downhill, with the scales lying down, and the blade slices the fibers clean off. Go against them and it lifts and rips them out in chunks. That is tear out, and reading the grain first prevents most of it before it ever happens. And when you have to work end grain, which is the raw face where you cut straight across the fibers, skew the blade and ease the far corner. A skewed blade slices instead of chopping, and easing that far edge first stops the corner from blowing out, which is that ugly crumble you get when the fibers past the edge have nothing behind them to hold on to. That is 3 tricks in, all before we even leave the cut itself. The next one matters more than any tool on this whole list, and it is the layout. In Japanese work, the joint is won at the marking line, not at the saw and not at the clamp. This is trick number 4, and it is the one I would tattoo on a beginner if he would hold still for it. Mark with a knife, not a pencil. A pencil line has real width, and it is a suggestion. A knife line severs the top wood fibers and leaves a tiny wall in the surface, and when you drop your chisel in to pare, it falls into that wall and stops dead on the line. Your joints tighten up the day you switch, and it is the cheapest upgrade in this video. A proper marking knife is a few dollars, or grab the utility knife already in your pocket. I chased tight joints with 3 different marking gauges before an old cabinet maker at my club watched me and said the tool was never my problem. I just could not read my own pencil line. He was right. He usually was. I hated that about him. Number 5 keeps you honest across a whole project. Lay out with a story stick instead of your tape measure. You take one stick, mark your real measurements on it one time, and transfer them everywhere they repeat. The reason is a little uncomfortable. 2 tape measures can disagree by a full 1/16 of an inch, sometimes an 1/8, which is about the thickness of a stacked nickel or 2. If you measure one part with one tape and the mating part with a different tape, you built a gap into the joint before you ever made a cut. Mark it once on the stick, transfer it to every piece, and every matching part actually matches. Whatever tape you start a project with, finish that project with the same tape. For long lines on rough timber, number 6. The Japanese reach for an ink line called a sumitsubo, which is the great-grandfather of your chalk line. It snaps a dead-straight reference across a board that is too long or too rough for a pencil and a straight edge to handle. On raw framing lumber or a wavy live-edge slab, a snapped line is the only truly straight thing in the whole equation, and you build off of it. Sit with the pattern here for a second. 4 of the first 6 tricks happen before you make a single cut. That is not an accident. The clean joint is decided at the line, and everybody who fights loose joints forever is fighting them at the saw, 5 steps too late. Number 7 and 8 go together, and they are both about patience beating muscle. Cut proud, then pare to the line. Leave your cut a hair fat, always on the waist side, and then pare down to that knife wall with a sharp chisel. You will land on the line every single time, instead of trying to nail it in one aggressive pass and blowing right past it. And before a drop of glue touches anything, the dry fit tells the truth. This is that habit I promised you at the start, the one that is not a tool at all. A good Japanese joint is built to go together tight exactly once. You assemble the whole thing bone dry, no glue, and it shows you every gap and every high spot while you can still fix them with a chisel. I skipped dry fits for years because I was in a hurry, and I glued up more than one project I then had to pry back apart in anger. These days I dry fit everything, even simple stuff. That habit has saved me more good hardwood than any tool in the building. You are probably picking up the theme by now. None of this is about horsepower or a bigger machine. It is a sharp edge and a precise line, which walks us straight into sharpening, because a Japanese carpenter's entire approach falls apart on a dull tool, and sharpening is exactly where most of us quit too early and blame ourselves. Here is the reframe that took me a decade to accept. You are probably not bad at chisel work. Your chisel is just dull, and a dull edge forces you to muscle the cut, and muscling the cut is where the slips and the crushed fibers and the wandering come from. A truly sharp edge does the work for you. Number 9, then, and it is the one everybody skips. Flatten the back of the blade first. On a chisel or a plane iron, everybody obsesses over the bevel, that angled front face. But the flat back is half of the actual cutting edge, and if the back is not dead flat and polished, you cannot get sharp no matter what you do to the bevel. Flatten that back once, really flatten it on your coarsest stone, and half of your sharpening trouble disappears for the life of the tool. 10 is why a Japanese blade just feels different in the wood. They are laminated. A thin layer of very hard, high-carbon steel is forge-welded onto a body of soft iron. The hard steel takes and holds a wicked edge, and the soft iron behind it is easy to grind, and it cushions that brittle edge so it does not chip out. I cannot give you the full metallurgy of why 2 welded steels beat 1 solid hardened blade. I am not a metal worker. I just know it takes and keeps an edge I could never coax out of my old hardware store chisels. Number 11. Put down the sandpaper and get a waterstone. A combination stone, 1,000 grit on one side and 6,000 on the other, runs about $40, and it will outsharpen the sandpaper on glass method over the long haul, as long as you flatten the stone itself now and then so it stays true. A dished stone sharpens a curved edge, and a curved edge is a dull edge. 12. Finish on a strop, which is just a strip of leather charged with a little polishing compound. A stropped edge is polished to a mirror, and a mirror edge slices wood fibers cleanly, instead of crushing through them, which is exactly why it stays sharp far longer between sharpenings. The polish is not vanity. It is edge life. Number 13, and this one saves your ego and your knuckles. Use a simple honing guide. Freehand sharpening looks impressive on camera, but a cheap Eclipse style guide for about $15 holds your bevel at a repeatable angle, somewhere around 25 to 30 degrees for most bench work. Actually, for paring softwood, drop it closer to 20 degrees so it slices easier. A repeatable angle beats an impressive one every day of the week, and nobody watching your finished box can tell whether you sharpened freehand. 14 closes out the tools, and it is a little one that saves a good chisel. On a Japanese chisel, the handle wears a steel hoop on the striking end, and there is a right way to set it. The hoop should sit just below the top of the wood, with the wood peened over it slightly, and you strike square down the middle. Do that and the handle never mushrooms out or splits. Get lazy, strike it cocked to one side, and you will wreck a good handle inside a season. Run the money on sharpening for a second, because it stacks up quietly. A guy buys a fresh set of cheap chisels every couple of years because the old ones will not hold an edge. Call it $30 a set, 3 or 4 times across a decade. That is over $100 chasing sharpness he could have had for free. The chisels held an edge fine. Nobody ever showed him how to put one back on them. My wife asked me once why I spend 20 minutes at a stone before I even start cutting. I told her the 20 minutes is the cutting. Everything after is cleanup. We are past the halfway mark now. That is 14 tricks, and almost every one so far has been about cutting clean and getting truly sharp. Now the joints, which is where all of that finally pays off. My club buddy who owns every tool made, and I mean a shop that looks like a showroom, still cannot cut a joint as tight as a guy with 3 sharp chisels and these habits. The gear was never the thing. Number 15 is the draw board pegged mortise and tenon, and it is the reason old timber frames are still standing with no metal in them at all. A mortise is the hole. The tenon is the tongue that fits into it. Normally you glue that and clamp it and wait. The draw bore skips the clamp and the weight entirely. You bore the peg hole through the sides of the mortise. Then you bore the matching hole in the tenon just a hair closer to the shoulder, offset by about 1/16 of an inch, roughly the thickness of a dime. When you drive a slightly tapered peg through, it has to pull the tenon shoulder tight into the joint to line the holes up, and it locks it there for good. No clamps, no glue clock ticking, and it holds for generations. Same working with the wood idea from the charred fence video, if you saw that one. You are letting a wooden peg and the wood itself do the clamping. Go too big on that offset though, and the peg either will not drive through at all, or it snaps the tenon trying. 1/16 is plenty. I got greedy and offset a full 1/8 on my first one, sheared the peg clean off inside the joint, and spent an evening drilling the stub out of a finished leg. Small offset, big grip, 16. When you need to join 2 beams end to end, a Japanese scarf joint, like a kanawatsugi, splices them into what looks like one single continuous timber, and it is far stronger than a butt joint, with a steel plate screwed over the seam. The interlocking cut and a small hardwood key wedged into the middle carry the load through the wood itself instead of through a handful of screws and shear. It looks like a magic trick, and it is really just very careful geometry and a sharp saw. Number 17. In solid wood joinery, a shop-made wooden peg beats a screw almost every time. A wooden peg flexes and moves with the wood around it as the seasons change, and it grips into end grain that a screw would just wedge apart and split. It is cheaper. It will never rust a black stain into your white oak, and you can whittle a fistful of them off a scrap in 10 minutes. 18 is the one that actually saves furniture, and it is more a mindset than a cut. Build every joint to let the wood move. Wood swells across its width in a humid summer and shrinks across it in a dry, heated winter, and it keeps doing that forever, not just while it is drying out. The Forest Products Laboratory has documented wood movement for decades, and the short version is that indoor furniture settles to somewhere around 6 to 9% moisture and still breathes with the seasons on top of that. In a swing climate like the Midwest or the Northeast, where the shop is bone dry in January and sticky in July, a wide flat sawn panel can move close to 1/4 inch across a foot of width between seasons, about the gap of 2 stacked quarters. Japanese joinery expects that movement and builds around it. Panels float loose in their grooved frames. Tenons get sized with a little room to breathe, so the wood can swell and shrink without tearing itself apart. Lock a solid panel down tight on all 4 sides and it will crack. It is not a question of if. Number 19. If you want to train the kind of dead-on accuracy that everything on this list needs, try a little kumiko, the delicate lattice work you see in the shoji screens and cabinet doors. The strips are thin, maybe 1/8 of an inch, about the thickness of a coffee stirrer, and they friction fit together with almost no glue at all. If your angles are off by even a whisker, nothing seats. It is the best precision practice there is. It is cheap because the strips are small, and you end up holding something quietly beautiful when nobody was expecting you to. 2 tricks on the surface itself before we get to the strange one. 20. And this one starts fights in the comments section, so let me be fair about it. Plane your final surface instead of sanding it. A sharp hand plane leaves a surface that is sheared clean and very slightly burnished, and it reflects light and sheds water in a way no sanded face ever does. Sandpaper tears the fiber ends off and leaves a fuzzy, scratched surface, even up at a fine grit. But I am not telling you to throw your sander in the trash. On figured or wild grain that wants to tear out, sanding is the safer bet, and I still reach for it. But on straight grain, a plain surface is a different animal, and you can feel it with your eyes closed. Number 21. Ease every sharp edge. The Japanese call that little chamfer mentori. You knock the razor corner off every edge, maybe a 1/16 of an inch, about the thickness of a nickel, with a couple of passes of a block plane or a sanding block. It stops the edge from splintering, it keeps the corner from denting the first time it bumps a door frame, and it lets a finish lay down evenly, instead of pulling thin and starving on a knife-sharp corner where it cannot hold. The last few before the payoff are about the wood and the shop, the stuff nobody bothers to tell a beginner. 22. Set the board the way the tree grew. Look at the curve of the growth rings on the end of the board, and that tells you which face pointed out toward the bark. Orient your boards deliberately across a panel, and it cups in a direction you planned for instead of surprising you. Number 23. You do not need a jointer to get a glue-ready edge. A sharp hand plane and a straight edge will true an edge, so two boards close, with no gap and no light showing through the seam, and two hand-trued edges make a glue joint stronger than the wood on either side of it. I built flat panels for years before I owned a single power tool, using a plane my grandfather left me in a rusty box. 24. Keep your tools rust-free and season your lumber. A wipe of camellia oil, or any light oil you have, keeps rust off your edges, and that matters a lot more in a humid Gulf Coast garage than in a dry shop out in Arizona. And let your boards sit in your shop for a week or two before you build, so they settle to your shop's own humidity first. Build with a board straight off the rack at the store, and it will move on you after it is assembled, and now you are chasing a gap you cannot close. I learned that the hard way on a walnut top I glued up the same afternoon I hauled the boards home in a cold truck. By the next week it had cupped enough to rock on the bench. The wood was not bad, I just never gave it time to catch up to my shop. Which brings me to number 25, the strange one I promised you way back at the start. The Japanese call it kigoroshi, which translates, and I am not making this up, to killing the wood. The idea is almost too simple. You have a tenon that is a hair too fat to slide into its mortise. The obvious move is to shave it down thinner. Do not do that. Instead, you take the rounded face of a hammer and you tap along the surface of that tenon, crushing the wood fibers down, compressing them like you would squeeze a sponge flat. The tenon is a touch smaller now, and it slides right home into the joint. Then you wipe a little water into the joint, or on some woods you just let the natural moisture in the air get to it, and those crushed fibers swell back up toward their original size, locking the tenon into the mortise so tight you can barely pull it apart again. You did not remove one shaving of wood. You borrowed the space, assembled the joint, and then gave the space back, and the fibers spring out and clamp the joint from the inside. Let that land for a second. You made the joint tighter by making the wood temporarily smaller. I have used it on a wedge-through tenon and watched a joint that was loose and rattling in my hand go rock solid by the next morning. It feels like cheating, but it is real, and Japanese boat builders have leaned on it for centuries to make plank seams swell watertight the moment the boat hits the water. A fair warning, because this is exactly where people ruin a good part. Kigoroshi works on soft woods and mild-grained woods that will compress and then spring back, like cedar, pine, cypress, and the softer hardwoods. On a hard, stiff wood like hard maple or white oak, you can crush the fibers so far that they tear and simply never come back. And now you have permanently made a weaker, smaller tenon that will not swell to fill anything. Use the rounded face of the hammer, never the flat face, and go easy. A few taps, not a beating. And on fine cabinetry where a joint has to stay perfectly flush, know that the swelling can shift your surfaces a hair, so test it on a scrap of your actual wood before you trust it on the real piece. Done right, on the right wood, it is the closest thing to magic in this whole video, and almost nobody outside Japanese joinery has ever heard of it. None of these 25 tricks is a gadget, and that is the entire point. A Japanese carpenter is not winning because of some secret tool you can order. He is winning at the marking line, on the sharpening stone, and by working with the wood instead of forcing it to obey. Pick one of these and try it this weekend. If you only take one thing out of the whole list, take the marking knife, because it will tighten up your next joint before you have even worked out the rest. Next time I want to build one real joint start to finish, a proper mortise and tenon, so you can watch all of this come together on a single piece. Go sharpen something.